and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Institute, and today we're bringing you some special guests from our Economics of a Pandemic webinar series, Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers and our Chief Economist Richard Dennis, to talk about what happens after the crisis and why snapback just won't cut it. This was recorded live on Wednesday the 29th of April 2020, and things may have changed since recording.
Well, worse at the Great Depression in one measure anyway. This is the latest dire warning of the economic hit.
Well, let's hope we've hit the bottom, but it's possible that things could get worse.
We're going to look at some reduction in Australia's real standard of living.
And we're confident that Australia will get through the coronavirus and come out stronger on the other side.
The other side, they can bounce back strongly.
The people down here in the northwest coast, they're talking about how they're going to survive when they come out of this. They're not talking about giving bigger companies more tax cuts. I can assure you that much.
So do you think it's feasible to kick 10% of Australians back to $40 a day?
We certainly, everything is on the table at the moment, looking at all of our policy options. Everything now needs to be put back on the table for the future to decide which way we're going and what we're going to do to get the economics back on its feet as quickly as possible.
Major announcement today from the Accent Group. That's the company behind brands like Hype, Athlete's Foot, Platypus. They're planning a staggered opening.
So Australia obviously appears to have been pretty successful at flattening the curve so far, and talk has already turned to what measures that we're going to need to restart the economy. The Prime Minister has said that business as usual isn't going to cut it, but then many people in business have proceeded to outline a program of tax cuts, deregulation and IR reform that, at least to me, seems pretty indistinguishable from business as usual. So we're delighted today to welcome the Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers to talk about the opportunities to build a better, fairer and smarter economy and what comes after the crisis. And he's joined today by our Chief Economist, Richard Dennis. Jim, thank you so much for joining us today and welcome to our Economics of a Pandemic webinar series.
Thanks for having me, Ebony. I've been looking forward to it.
So do you want to kick us off, Jim? You have already you've written a great article in The Guardian about what happens after the crisis, but where do we find ourselves and where do we go from here?
Yeah, thanks very much for getting such a big group of us together to talk about what I think are the most important questions. And you're right that I engaged with some of those in a piece in The Guardian earlier this month. So I'd like to plug that if people are interested in some further reading. Than a lot of what I think about this period and these and what the future looks like has been captured one way or another in that piece, but I'm looking forward to expanding on it today. You acknowledged rightly the First Nations people of Australia. I want to acknowledge the Yugambeh and the Yagara people from Logan City and the southern suburbs of Brisbane as well. It's good to be back with Richard Dennis as well. We are in some ways a dangerous combination. For those of the people who have plugged in today who aren't aware, we last caught up at an event in the State Library of Queensland in Brisbane a couple of months ago. Seems like a lifetime ago. But we were talking then about what we need to do in economics and especially what we need to do to better kind of measure our progress. And it was sort of surprising in some regards that these, what I think to be common sense about how we add to all of the data that we have about the economy. How do we measure well-being? How do we measure progress? How do we measure sustainability, mental health, and all these sorts of things? For one reason or another, the Treasurer almost combusted at the temerity of our suggestions last time. And so I think, Richard, we need to be very careful about our contribution today. The Treasurer's well-being is very important at a time like this, and so I might come back and touch on very, very briefly at the end some of those themes, and obviously happy to take questions about it as well, and happy to take questions about the political scene at the moment. But I thought in this sort of introduction I might focus almost exclusively on the economics of where we're up to, because although the economics don't tell the whole story about what we're going through and what the new Australia looks like after this crisis, that it obviously tells a massive part of the story about what recovery looks like, what a new, rebuilt, recovered reconstructed Australia looks like after this coronavirus crisis. I like that people think about kind of AC after COVID and BC before COVID. So I thought I'd kind of pick up on that demarcation too, because I think it's really important. If we want to understand where we're going, we sort of have to have, a good appreciation of where we've been BC if we're going to understand what's going to happen AC. And I think there is a heightened recognition now, a welcome recognition, that really one of the defining features of the economy before anyone had even heard of coronavirus was really insecure and precarious work lives. And this crisis has really shone a light on that defining feature of the economy really for the last 6 or 7 years in advance of the crisis hitting. And they're all kind of constituent parts to the challenges that we had in the economy, towards the end of last year even, but had been developing for some years. Clearly, we've had stagnant wages for a while. We've had very flat or declining business investment. Productivity's been flat. Living standards have been flat. We've had record household debt. We've had a whole range of not opinions about the economy, but facts about how the economy's been performing, which were troubling us even before some of these more recent acute issues popped up. And the point I want to make about that is that a lot of the things that we're seeing now have really accelerated some of those concerns rather than sort of popped up freshly. We did enter this crisis, unfortunately, in a position of relative economic weakness rather than a position of economic strength. Our unemployment rate was a fair bit higher than our peers. A whole range of indicators in the economy were troubling, to say the least. So now we're in this crisis, and whether it's the Reserve Bank or the Commonwealth Treasury or the private sector forecasters, really most people now expect there to be a very substantial spike in the unemployment rate, double-digit unemployment, give or take a percentage point or two. But also, I think underneath that, there's all those issues around underemployment. I thought the Reserve Bank Governor did a good job highlighting the issue of hours worked in the economy, which he expects to decline by something like a fifth, which is a massive number. And the ABS, under the leadership of David Gruen's been doing a good job giving us real-time understanding of the problem as well. And so in all of that context, all of the seriousness of this health crisis, which has become an economic crisis, I think the government, to be fair, has taken some welcome steps, certainly some steps that Labor in the first instance called for, like wage subsidies and some of the other steps that the government's taken. And we welcome the fact that they have done some things that are not typically the levers that they reach for. And, in the instances where we called for wage subsidies and they said it was a bad idea but eventually came to our view, that's a good thing that they came to our view. And I think that the Institute's made that point one way or another in recent weeks as well. But I think we're at real risk of these wage subsidies being a good idea, which aren't being perfectly implemented, to say the least. Too many workers are being excluded from them. More than 1 million casuals won't have access to these JobKeeper payments. Clearly, there are issues, particularly with casual workers in construction, casual teachers, casual uni staff, people who work in the entertainment and events sector. And I know you've had a standalone event on that in the last couple of weeks as well. So there are big holes in what the government's proposing. A good step in the right direction will help a lot of people stay connected to the labour market, but nothing stopping the government from expanding it so that more workers maintain that link with their employers. And that matters obviously in the near term as we think about those long lines of people outside Centrelink in recent weeks and calling MPs' offices, including mine. But it also matters how many people we can keep attached to the labour market. Matters for how we come out of this crisis as well. It matters for the recovery and for those people who have, strong memories of the early 90s recession. One of the problems there was that people who became attached from the labour market either took a very long time to reattach or in many cases, particularly older workers, they didn't find their way back into the workforce at all. So it's critically important that we get this right. And I think, and you rightly mentioned at the start, Ebony, that we have made some really welcome progress on the health front. On the health front, Australians have done a good job doing the right thing in the main, with some high-profile exceptions. But they've done a good job. We have been flattening the curve, and that's a very good thing. And our spokespeople, Chris Bowen and Anthony Albanese and others, have welcomed that progress. But I think what we need to guard against is that those good developments, convert into some sort of complacency about the economic consequences of some of those necessary steps on the health front. And I think where this risk of complacency is best captured is when we come to the Prime Minister's language about the so-called snapback, which is a very, which will become a very prominent term over the next 6 months or so as people judge what happens in the economy against his expectations for the economy and some of the language about snapping back. And I think it's troubling even in the coverage and the commentary today after a very useful committee in Canberra yesterday, which looked at some of these issues, is that with the reopening of some parts of our society and some parts of our economy, it feeds that assumption that things are going to come good quickly. And I think that's a dangerous assumption. That would be good if it were true. Clearly, some sectors are going to come back much quicker than others. But I think snapback has two main sets of problems associated with it. The first one is an assumption that people will snap back to work. And there's a lot of people on this call who will understand that unemployment, particularly in crisis times, is notorious for rising very quickly and for declining very slowly. And so for a lot of Australian workers, the recovery will be patchy, it'll be slow. I think the Reserve Bank Governor talked about a long shadow from this crisis, and that really is a rebuke to those people who think that the economy will snap back quickly. It will be a patchy recovery, and we need to be careful about how we withdraw the support from the economy, which has been, provided to workers in the economy. It almost matters as much how you turn the tap off as it mattered how you turn the tap on, and particularly when it comes to the speed of turning it on and turning it off. But I think the second part of snapback, which is troubling, and again you alluded to it in your introduction, is this idea that we will snap back to all of the old kind of failed prescriptions of the past, particularly when it comes to that kind of Institute of Public Affairs agenda around, harsh deregulation, austerity, industrial relations reform. It will be news to a lot of Australian workers who it's just dawned on just how insecure and precarious their work lives are, that the answer to that is to make things more secure and more precarious for people. I think if we went back to more of the same ideas that have been failing the last 7 years, then that would be a recipe for more stagnation and longer stagnation, whether it's in wages, unemployment, broad-based growth, and all of the things that we care about the most. And so the point I'd make about that, I'm getting towards the end of this introduction, is that we can't keep going like we were before in the way that the economic debate was set up. So much has changed. We don't know whether it's temporary or permanent. We don't know whether some of the changes we're seeing now are some kind of historical oddity or something more enduring. But we do know a light's been shone on insecurity in the economy. We do know that people have been more reliant on public institutions to be part of the solution to what we're going through. We do know that everybody's work-family balance has been impacted in some way or another. We are reconsidering what's essential in our economy and in our society. And there will be a temptation for countries, not just ours, to kind of bring up the drawbridge on our international relations and our foreign engagement, and that has implications for our local workforce as well. And people are petrified about what all this means. And many people on the call would understand this either in their own lives or the people that they talk to. People are really worried that a story is going to be written about the economy and society after this crisis, and that large swathes of the Australian population are going to be written out of that story. And that's a fear that I share as well. I think it will be really disappointing if we ask Australians to make all of these sacrifices to get through this, massive challenge in our health system, our economy and our society. If they get to the other side and they are told by their government that, all of a sudden, good news, it turns out that what we need to do now is all of the things that we were saying for the last 7 years that the country needed to do. I think we can do better than that. We need to have a big conversation about how we grow the economy in a more inclusive way and how we create good jobs. And I think we need to start by working out where is there capacity for genuine common ground to be found. And even if you make a quick list off the top of your head, clearly there's something needs to be done to get business investing again. That should be more targeted than lots of the ways that the government has proposed in the past. Clearly, energy policy has been a handbrake on inclusive growth, and we need to get that right. Clearly, there is a need, if we care about full employment, we need to think about labour market programs. Social housing. There's almost a consensus on New Start, now Job Seeker, that the old rate was too low. It's the business community thinks that. John Howard thinks that. It's really just the current government that's been dragging its heels. We need to think about training, particularly making sure people can adapt and adopt new technology. Surely we can agree on that. And we need to think of the role of science and research and development, particularly for those of us who care about making sure we have some industrial and specifically manufacturing capacity in this country. So we care about what Australia looks like AC. We had some challenges BC before the coronavirus. In my portfolio work, in my political work, I think our objectives need to be, broad prosperity, how we distribute and redistribute opportunity, how we make things sustainable environmentally, but in terms of our long-term decision-making as well. And clearly there are other important pillars, which we probably won't have time to talk about today, around democracy, national identity, national security, and all of those other things as well. And to finish where I started before we go to Richard and some questions, I do think in addition to all of the ways that we have traditionally measured how we're going, I do think that we can do a better job of measuring what matters, agreeing as a nation what we care about most in the economy and measuring our progress against those yardsticks.
Thank you so much, Jim, and just a big welcome to everyone from Jim's home state of Queensland. I've got people on the line here that I can see from the Gold Coast and upwards from there, so welcome. And welcome to everyone else from across the country who is joining us. We're currently sitting on 2,411 participants. I'll have to check, but I think this makes this webinar, Jim, our most popular event that the Australia Institute has ever held, certainly the biggest. So congratulations, and thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in. And thank you for that opening, that really excellent opening of all the issues that we're currently facing, Jim. Richard, did you want to respond before we start getting into questions?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Eb, and thanks, Jim, for coming on. It's wonderful to see that so many people are interested in the dismal science of economics. So to all those out there, thanks for joining us. I like Jim's AC and BC. I'd like to add DC during the crisis. So before the crisis, as Jim said, the economy was not doing too well. Low wage growth, low productivity growth, low economic growth. During the crisis, all of those things, there's a garbage truck just pulled up out the front of me. Apologies for the background noise, but good to see the transport workers are still out there. During the crisis, obviously those things are going to get worse. And I really think a key thing for people to get their heads around is that the government is spending as if it's Keynesian, but it's not thinking as if it's Keynesian. The government has announced enormous amounts of expenditure, a typically Keynesian response. Now, what does a Keynesian response mean? Well, Keynesian economics, which developed in the 1930s, basically says when private sector demand is declining, when individuals aren't spending, when private businesses aren't investing, the only way to keep the economy afloat, the only way is for the public sector to fill that hole, for the public sector to spend about as much as the private sector has reduced its spending. Now, everything the government has said sounds Keynesian, They've announced $200 billion worth of new spending in the last 2 months. That's a very Keynesian-sounding response. But as we heard yesterday, most of that money that's been announced hasn't been spent yet. In fact, most of the money, $6 billion of new money flowing into the economy, is people withdrawing their own money from their superannuation, and the government itself has only put in $4 billion so far. So the idea that they've gone early and gone hard, well, they've announced early and they've announced hard, but the money's not flowing yet, and that's a big problem. So we can cut them a little bit of slack. Maybe in a week or two, we'll see tens of billions start to flow. But until tens of billions of dollars start to flow, let's be clear, the government is just talking Keynesian, not acting Keynesian. But also when we think about the DC, the during the crisis period, the government isn't thinking Keynesian when it's developing policy. It's got this trickle-down approach that if only it gives enough money to the private sector, that money will trickle down and create jobs. Now, there's some short-term truth to that. It's not a bad idea. The posting the checks out quickly as Wayne Swan did, posting the checks out quickly as this government did, it's great. It hits fast, it works. But that's not thinking Keynesian. Thinking Keynesian requires us to ask much harder questions, like how can the tourism industry snap back if we're not going to let planes fly into the country? How could it snap back? The only reason a tourism company employs people to work in tourism is because there are customers. If people are flying to the Great Barrier Reef and they want to go on a tour, then a tourism operator employs people to take them on that tour. Well, if we're going to stop the planes coming into Australia for another 6 or 12 months, let's be clear, the tourism industry will not be snapping back. It can't snap back. We can keep it on life support, and that's a good thing to do, but we can't pretend that the economy will snap back when the government is still, rightly, as a health measure, suppressing enormous amounts of economic activity. So the government is yet to start to think Keynesian and start to think about what are, as Jim mentioned, what are the labour market programs that we can start to create now that will literally employ hundreds of thousands of people in North Queensland or Tasmania or southern New South Wales who currently are on a job keeper payment by someone, for example, in the tourism industry, but there will be no snapping back for that part of the economy. So the government needs to quickly start to invent the policies that will get us through the medium and longer term part of this crisis. The spending the money bit, the pushing the cash out the door bit, sure, they announced a lot, they haven't spent it yet, but that's just the beginning. We need to have active government programs that are going to, quote, create demand for labour in those parts of the economy, because cutting the corporate tax rate for BHP will not create jobs for tourism workers in Queensland. Cutting the company tax rate for the Commonwealth Bank will not create work for tourism operators in Tasmania. So typically in Australia, as soon as we have any opportunity, powerful voices come out and say, as luck would have it, my wish list is the best way to help you. And for years, we've been told that we needed to cut the company tax rate to do it's going to solve all of our ills. And as luck would have it, we have an entirely new and entirely enormous and entirely unexpected crisis. And we're instantly being told, oh, as luck would have it, that thing that I've wanted for 20 years is the perfect thing to get us through this. Well, cutting the company tax rate won't create jobs for the people that are actually losing them.
Thanks, Richard. We're just getting loads of questions coming through now. Thank you, everyone who's using that Q&A function. There's a couple in the chat as well. I might just go to questions now, if that's all right, because we're not going to get through all of these. So I'm going to start with a question from Wendy Tubman, who asks, How can we get those in power to heed the words of Professor Ross Garnaut to use this time to shift to a more sustainable system? Jim, I'll go to you first.
Thanks very much, Wendy. I think, one of the really useful points that Ross has been making, particularly in that book that he recently wrote, which many people have read, including, I'm sure, many people on this call, is that we should be seeing renewable energy as an opportunity to get some of our business input costs down. And we should be seeing renewable energy as one of the ways that we can compete with the world, our businesses can compete with the world, rather than seeing energy costs as this kind of prohibitive problem which lies there not dealt with. And so I think over time, whatever people think about, the argument about climate change and something that I believe in, which is the need to get emissions down, there's a whole nother element of this which Ross has done a good job shining a light on, which is, at the end of the day, this is as much as anything about cheaper and cleaner energy. And if you were worried, as I am and many of you would be, about the fact that without decent levels of investment, we really won't create the jobs that we need, the good, well-paying jobs that we need in our economy. If you care about investment, then the absence of, a settled energy policy has been a big part of that. I've done heaps of these Zoom conversations and heaps of, boardroom meetings and all the rest of it over the last few years, and especially over the last year. And the only thing that comes up almost every single time is a lack of energy certainty. And so I think the more that we can consider, not everyone will agree with every part of what Ross has written, but the basic argument that we have an opportunity here to get energy costs down, get business input costs down, to get some investment certainty, and create jobs in good industries of the future, then I think that's a really welcome contribution.
Thanks, Jim. Before we go to you, Richard, Irene Tonetti, sorry, I can't see your whole surname there. We're going to come to you next after Richard answers this question. Richard.
Thanks, Eb. Yeah, look, renewables should play a very important role in this during the crisis period. And my colleague Matt Grudnoff and Dave Richardson and I wrote a paper recently on how to pick good projects. What are the kind of projects that we need during this period? And the criteria we said involve around, you want labour-intensive industries that rely on local production that deliver lasting benefits. So labour, local, lasting. They're good criteria. And guess what they apply very well to? Renewable energy. Let me give people a way to think about this. When you build a coal-fired power station or a gas-fired power, you need a fair bit of capital, a little bit of labour, and over the life of the project, an enormous amount of fuel. Okay, so over the life of a coal-fired power station or a life of a gas-fired power station, really most of what you're spending money on is fuel. A little bit of capital up front, a little bit of labour up front, a lot of fuel for the next 20 or 30 years. With renewables, it's quite different. You need a fair bit of capital up front, you need a fair bit of labour up front, and you'll never buy fuel. Not once will you ever buy fuel. So the reasons that often renewables find it hard to compete with coal is that the upfront cost of capital is high, the upfront cost of labour is high, and the fuel savings in the future, well, we discount that. Well, if capital is usually expensive and labour is usually expensive, and that's why we don't build renewables, guess when the perfect time to build renewables is? We've got 2% interest rates and 1 million unemployed people. And if we combine cheap capital and unemployed labour, what we get is a source of energy that will never spend a cent on fuel for the next 20 or 30 years. So even if you didn't believe in climate change, even if you thought all of it was baloney, what we can do is take idle labour and cheap capital to turn it into something that will never need to buy fuel. The economics of this could not be. The government says ideology is past. Well, when you see them spending billions of dollars on new renewables, you'll know the ideology is past.
Thanks, Richard. Irene, we'll come to you. Are you there? Do you have a question for the panel?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me? Oh, I'm most concerned that with this pandemic crisis, that they're ignoring the arts industry. What should we be doing regarding the arts industry? You know, Sydney Theatre Company alone has dismissed all its people, and also the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra. It's a very serious situation to be in. Have you got any comment, please?
Thanks, Irene. I will also let you know that we've done a previous webinar on that, Irene, with Senator Sarah Hanson-Young that you can have a listen to. But Jim, I'll go to you first on that one.
Yeah, thanks, Irene. I think one of the consequences of this crisis is that perhaps Australians who aren't directly involved in the arts, entertainment, events industries have discovered what a big part of our economy and our society it is. And for the reasons that you rightly identify, for every production, every event, every exhibition, there is a large workforce of people, often casuals, often in what we would consider to be pretty vulnerable parts of the labour market, who service those opportunities for the country to have that kind of cultural nourishment. And so I think the most important thing that can be done, and this isn't that well recognised, but the Treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, actually has the powers in the legislation on these JobKeeper payments, these wage subsidies, to change the rules to include or exclude certain groups, and who can access these payments. And whether it's Tony Burke, our Shadow Arts Minister, and also Shadow Industrial Relations Minister, or a whole range of colleagues, we've been making the point repeatedly that the unemployment lines will be longer than they need to be because Frydenberg hasn't exercised those powers we gave him to include workers like casual workers who might be employed in the arts sector over a long period, but maybe their employer that they're currently working to or were currently working to, might not have been with them for more than 12 months. And so they are excluded from the program, we think unnecessarily. And if you included them, as he has the power to do with the stroke of a pen, then that would mean that some of those people who are lined up outside Centrelink would instead be maintaining a link with their employers, and the unemployment rate wouldn't be higher than it needs to be. That sector that you just asked about is really one of the sensitive ones. There's also, teachers, uni staff, construction workers, for a whole range of reasons. That rule that says you have to have been a casual for longer than 12 months means that there will be hundreds of thousands of people unnecessarily on the unemployment scrap heap when they don't need to be.
Tim, Richard, did you want to add to that?
Look, absolutely. As I said before, how do we choose good public policy? Let's go back a step. The government's already spent $200 billion in the last 2 months. In the next 12 months, it will announce at least another $100 billion worth of spending. There is no shortage of money. We are going to spend an enormous amount of money. What we have to do is decide on what and on who. So going back to those criteria I mentioned, go labour intensive, local production, go lasting benefits. Does supporting the entertainment and the arts industry tick those boxes? Of course it does. Very, very labour intensive. Nearly all of the production is local. And what society doesn't want to have a vibrant arts and entertainment industry when we come out of this? I mean, what's the first thing we're going to do when we're not locked down? What's the first thing we're going to do when we're allowed to mingle in large crowds? We're going to go and hope someone's putting on something fun or interesting to do. I mean, how ridiculous would it be for us to let the industry that everyone's desperate to go and consume, how ridiculous to let that die on the vine because of some bizarre notions of what a casual is or what a worker is that requires support.
Thanks for that excellent question, Irene. And I've posted a link to our webpage that features all the previous video recordings of our previous webinars, including that special one on the arts industry. So you can check that out there. But that was a great question. The next one is from Daniel Ray. He asks, instead of a snapback, can we aim for a reshape of the economy and society? Someone's commented also about the sustainability angle, but Jim, I was also thinking about that insecure work angle as well. What are the other elements we should be thinking about if we're thinking about reshaping our economy?
Yeah, thanks, Daniel, and others for the input. And I've seen some other comments pop up on the screen along these lines too. I think it would be a national tragedy if we asked Australians to make all these sacrifices and we get to the other end and we say everything needs to be exactly as it was before. And on a political level, you can see why the government wants people to think that. They want there to be some sort of normalcy or some sort of familiarity in our society, because everyone is really kind of unbalanced at the moment with the way that our lives have been impacted by this crisis. But I don't think we can snap back to all of those old approaches, and they, as I said in my introduction, were a recipe for really insecure work. I saw that the ACTU put out a number this morning by Sally McManus that said that something like 40% of workers in the economy are in insecure jobs, and that's clearly too much. No sort of self-respecting, first-rate, first-world economy should treat its workers this shabbily or create lives which are so precarious. We don't want to snap back to that. We do want the country to be prosperous. That's a big priority for us, but it needs to be, broad prosperity and not increasingly narrowed. We need to care about how the opportunities of that prosperity are distributed in our society. I represent an area which has traditionally had pockets of serious disadvantage, and what keeps me up at night, the reason I'm involved in politics, is because when that cascades through generations, then we do communities a disservice, but we do the country a disservice if we're not doing what we can to tackle that disadvantage. On the sustainability front, the sort of short-term decision-making which has bedeviled our politics for a long time sells the country short. It means that, that if we continue down this path, then the Australia that my 1-, 3-, and 5-year-old will inherit will be inferior to the one that we occupy. And so for all of those reasons, I think snapback in ideas is a dangerous concept, and we need to work out what we care most about. The ones that I just mentioned, but also a sense of our national identity is very important. That's what Richard's answer to Irene's question went to as well. There's a great book by Jared Diamond called Upheaval, which talks about countries needing to have the kind of ego strength to deal with crises. And that's partly about culture. It's partly about community. It's about the way that we interact with each other. So there are a whole range of ways which we could go on for a long time about, where I'm sure each of us could imagine a better version of Australia than the one that existed BC. And I think the onus is on all of us to make the case for that.
It's a really important question. There's a couple of reasons that we will not snap back, and there's also reasons why we shouldn't. The first is that let's just talk about what we know. Every month in Australia, thousands of businesses go out of business and hundreds of thousands of workers change jobs and change industries. So the economy is actually tumultuous. It's always changing. So for the government to say, look, in 6 months' time, we're just going to pick up where we left off. Well, in any normal 6 month time, that would be impossible, let alone in a crisis like this, where in 6 months' time, China, America, and Europe will be fundamentally different than they were before this started. So it's impossible for the economy to, quote, snap back to the way it was. And the sooner we admit that to ourselves, the sooner we can start to design policies accordingly. The other thing is you raised the question of shape. And, I always try to get people to think about the shape of the economy, not the size of the economy. It's up to us. It's up to us. We have agency, what we want the economy to look like. People in Northern Europe, like Sweden and Norway and Denmark, have chosen to have an economy that is very different in shape to people in Singapore. No one's right. No one's wrong. It's a democracy. But what do you want more of? You want to have a big, wonderfully effective public health system, public education system, and public transport system, Or do we collectively want a system where it's up to the individuals, and if you can afford good health and education, you should get it? Those questions about the shape of our economy are far more important to our well-being than whether GDP grew at 3.5 or 3.3% last quarter. So we have to ask the question, which bits of the economy do we want to grow? Which bits of the economy do we want to grow really fast? And which bits are we actually happy to see phase out? The economy today doesn't look anything like it looked 20 years ago. There was no mobile phone industry. There was no internet industry. There was no online retail 20 years ago. Well, guess what? In 10 or 20 years' time, the economy is going to look quite different as well. It's up to us to decide what shape we want. And any private sector CEO who when asked, how did you spend the crisis? Hello, Mr. Well-Paid or Mrs. Well-Paid CEO, what did you do during the crisis? Every one of them in 6 months' time will be bragging about how they used the opportunity of the crisis to reshape their business, to change processes, to change the strategy of the firm so that going out of the crisis, the company is better positioned. You listen, the business pages are going to be full of this self-serving guff. Yet we've got a Prime Minister saying, no, if we can just come out looking exactly like we went in, that'll be a win. It's nonsense. We have to understand both that the economy was going to change anyway, regardless of our will, and the people have will about what they'd like the economy to look like. And if we have that debate, then we can actually have a well-being economy that delivers for people, not just a slightly bigger version of the economy that people were unhappy with.
Thanks, Richard. And thanks again, everyone who's joined us today. We got up to, I think at the peak, 2,465 participants. So we really appreciate you all being here today. Fiona Stanley, I'm not sure if you can hear me there. Do you have a question for the panel?
Yes, I do. Thanks very much. Can you hear me, Ebony?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Jim, for this. And hi, Richard. I've got a question which goes from BC, DC to AC. And of course, I'm a scientist, and what I'm hopeful for always that we have science and data driving and evidence driving decision making. If you want to get to a changed shape in the economy, Richard, where's the evidence? How are we going to get that voice of reasonable evidence? Now, BC, we didn't get looking. Science has been denigrated. We've been lobbying for climate change and the health effects of climate change. Forget it. It was industry driving decision-making and not science. We've become, epidemiologists have become the heroes of this epidemic. We're not just criticised for creating a nanny state. We're applauded because what we're doing is getting us out of this amazing pandemic, and epidemiology and science is now really valued. So what is going to happen, AC? How are we going to get not just science and its really rigorous decision-making and evidence into economic and other decisions, health decisions and community decisions, but also how do we get citizens' voices? We feel a bit paralysed that we've got so many good opportunities to get citizens' voices in. And when you give, I work a lot with Aboriginal people, when you give Aboriginal people a voice, boy, are the solutions successful. Thank you.
Thanks for a great question. Richard, I might go to you first on this one.
Yeah, sure. Oh, thank you, Fiona. Look, it's a really important question, and I accept the premise of it entirely, but I would make a distinction. Governments listen to scientists, when they feel like it, and they ignore them when they feel like it. So, for example, the Australian government has been enthusiastic about embracing science when it comes to, for example, something like genetic modification of crops. And when people have said, I'm a bit nervous about that, successive governments have waved around scientific reports and said, you're being crazy. The science is settled. What are you worried about? By the way, I'm not personally too worried about GM crops. I'm just using the example that when governments want to listen to science, they do. And you say that they only listen to industry. You're right. They do listen to some industries. They've listened to the coal industry. They've listened to the oil industry. They listen to the gas industry. But when the renewable energy industry shows up and says, hey, look at the benefits of us, they get slapped down with crazy populist critiques of climate science, or even crazy populist critiques of of how the energy transmission system works. And we get all these sort of armchair experts wanting to talk about synchronous and asynchronous power when they don't know what either word means. So don't get me wrong, I understand entirely what you're saying, but in order to improve our politics, that we need to ask the question, how come governments are so good at listening to some scientific advice? How come when it comes to defence spending, governments are so good at spending money today to protect us from threats in the future? And how come sometimes those same governments ignore science, whether it's epidemiological evidence about the advantages of preventative health, or whether it's climate scientists warning us of some threats? So how come our government can listen to science when it wants to and listen to industry when it wants to, and then just be so dismissive of science and industry when it doesn't? I think that's a really harder question to ask, but I think the opportunity coming out of this is the whole world can listen to Donald Trump every day and see what the consequences of science denial means. And listening to that man last night tell me that America's testing more people than anyone in the world and everything's fine. These are the same people that have said greenhouse gas emissions, aren't going to cause us problems in the future. So it's a terrible experiment, but the Australian government has listened to science, it's acted, and it's saved a lot of people's lives. The Americans haven't listened to science and they've killed a lot of people. I think what we have to do is make sure the public sees the benefits of listening to science all of the time, rather than cherry picking when we want to listen to science and when we don't.
Jim?
Well, I think that's about the nub of it. We can't pick and choose here. I think one of the interesting aspects of the last couple of months is to hear the same politicians, lean heavily on expert advice, being the same politicians who have, sought to kind of diminish the role of experts and the role of science in other policy areas. And I think Richard did a good job of pulling that apart. I think Fiona, and thanks for being on the call, and it's an honour that you're on here. I think if you think about the changes over the last couple of months, and I said a bit about this before, but we don't want this reliance on experts to be a temporary historical oddity that we talk about in a decade's time. Remember that period where we were heavily reliant on expert advice? Clearly, and as Richard said, we need to do a much better job, not just of when we pick and choose who we listen to, doing a better job of picking and choosing, but institutionalising that as well, making sure that, CSIRO is sufficiently empowered. The CSIRO put out a report via this big panel of some very impressive thought leaders about the future of the economy. They've put that out in the last year or so. I've only seen a small number of references to it in the public debate. I try and push it wherever I can, but we need to do more to elevate the views of whether it's CSIRO panels, the work that you're doing. I know that you're doing work with other friends on how we measure progress here and around the world. So clearly we can do a much better job. We won't actually get to the right outcomes if we rely on ideology alone. That's been part of the problem rather than part of the solution. So the more we can institutionalise expert advice, the better. I think we're probably going to have time for one question before we go. So this one that I wanted to ask is from Matthew Ryan, and he asks, how can we reshape the national conversation on government debt? And getting past the household spending analogies and how we pay down the debt questions would seem to be central in avoiding a conservative pivot to austerity, excuse me, especially as we saw in Europe after the GFC. Now, Jim, obviously you had front row seats to the GFC and Australia's response. I noticed Ken Henry on Radio National this morning was already talking about, well, it wasn't actually China or the mining industry that led Australia out of the GFC. What lessons do we have from there about how we got out of it, but also how can we reshape that conversation around debt? Yeah, a great question. Thank you for that. Look, there's a few elements to it. The first thing is I think the government has, despite 10 or 12 years of rhetoric about government intervention and cash payments and debt and deficit, I think they have in some ways learned the lessons from 2009, that there is a role for government intervention, particularly in crisis time, and that the highest priority then is to save as many jobs and communities as is possible. They've partly learned that lesson. But what remains to be seen is whether they've learned the lesson from 2014. And many of you will remember that horror budget in the Abbott-Hockey government, where they asked the most vulnerable people to carry a disproportionate load when it came to, paying back some of the debt that had accumulated for the right reasons during the global financial crisis. We don't yet know how the government is going to approach that challenge. It would be, disappointing in the extreme if they didn't learn the lessons from 2014. On the broader question of government debt, and I know that there will be a range of views on this call and indeed in the broader community as well. I think debt matters. I don't think it's the most important consideration in the depths of a crisis, but I think ideally over time in a responsible and sensible way that doesn't ask the most vulnerable people to do all the heavy lifting, then ideally you would pay that back over time. And one of the reasons for that is even before this crisis, when public debt had more than doubled, the Commonwealth was paying about $17 billion this year on servicing that debt. I think all of us can come up with better uses for $17 billion of taxpayer money. So I think that debt will need to be repaid at some stage. How you go about that is the most important thing. Lastly, I agree with you that it's frustrating when people try and pretend that public debt is exactly the same as household debt. But at the same time as we've had an issue around public debt, there is an issue also separately with household debt. Household debt was literally at record highs before the crisis hit, and you can only imagine what people are doing on credit cards, on redraw facilities, on temporary arrangements with their banks, deferrals of repayments and the like. That one of the reasons why the Reserve Bank is worried about the long tail from this crisis is because people will wake up in December or March or whenever, and that the household debt issue that they had already will be that much more acute because of what people have had to do, understandably, to get themselves and their loved ones through this crisis. So I think there are two separate challenges which shouldn't be, entirely dismissed.
Sorry, Richard, did you want to answer?
I agree with what Jim said. It's interesting. We talk about using the household analogy to understand public debt. There's so many problems with that, but let's take it seriously for a second. Imagine there was an analogy between household debt and government debt. What would the first lesson be? The government should borrow a lot more money. Households are far more in debt as a percentage of their income than the Australian government is. So if there's an analogy there, it's that households love debt. Households borrow a lot more money than the public sector does, and having debt isn't burdensome if the debt is being used to invest in things like a house that you think will deliver lasting benefits. So, I know it's frustrating for people. People often say to me, look, I saw one of the messages before, how can we get politicians to understand the theory of money? How do we get people to understand? What matters is what decisions politicians make, not what words they use and not what theory they say they subscribe to. Most politicians know nothing, and certainly I know nothing about how to design a car. Doesn't mean I can't drive one. I don't understand the theory behind how my iPad works, but, I'm on my iPad all the time. So I think we need to understand that we need to have a democratic conversation about what governments do. And of course there needs to be a debate about theory and words, but ultimately for voters what matters is what governments do. So the premise of the question was, how do we get governments to treat debt differently? Well, they just have. The government has just racked up hundreds of billions of dollars in debt. They're clearly Keynesian in their approach to economic management. They clearly don't believe that debt is bad. What we need to do is ensure that when we come out of this, we have a consistent conversation to the one we're having right now. So, Jim's question of how long should we pay the debt back for? Well, as an economist, I'd say there's no right answer to that. BHP, you might have heard of it, it's been in debt for 100 years. My colleague Dave Richardson talks about this all the time. BHP's never repaid its debts. It's been making profits for a century and it hasn't repaid its debts. And if it tried to repay all of its debts today, its shareholders would get grumpy and say, what are you paying debt off for? We'd rather you go invest in a new profitable mine and make us 20% than repay some debt that's costing us 5%. So, the household analogy to debt doesn't work. The corporate sector analogy to debt doesn't work. We just need to understand that what debt does is bring forward consumption from the future to the present. And if we're bringing forward activities that will deliver lasting benefits, it's a great idea. So what we're spending the debt on is more important, I think, than how big is it.
Just a very quick one from you, Jim, just to wrap us up. Someone was pointing out on the question, and I'm sorry, I've just lost it here in the Q&A. They asked about young people wearing so many of the negative outcomes of this crisis. Jim, in a minute, can you tell me what we can do to help young people through this crisis?
You're right that because this crisis and the aftermath will be really patchy, that the most vulnerable people will be worst impacted, and that will clearly the burden will fall disproportionately on young people in particular who don't have long enduring attachments to the labour market. Clearly in the first instance we need to get as many people accessing that JobKeeper payment as possible, and in the medium and long term we need to do a better job, whether it's labour market programs, the training system, or in other innovative ways, to make sure that we don't lose a whole generation of workers and all of the intergenerational carnage that would bring, not just our economy, but our broader society.
Thank you so much. We'll wrap it up there. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. I'm really sorry we didn't get to all of them. Thank you to Richard, but especially thank you to you, Jim Chalmers, for joining us today. That was a great conversation.
Thanks very much, and I'm really pleased with the interest that people have shown, and let's keep the conversation going. I'm conscious that I'm in many ways the warm-up act for Joe Stiglitz tomorrow, so I hope people enjoy that conversation too.
Thank you very much, and that's right. We have not one but two Nobel Prize laureates coming up as guests on our webinar in the next 7 days. If you're an early riser, or even if you aren't, join us from your bed at 6 a.m. tomorrow for a discussion with Nobel laureate economist Professor Joseph Stiglitz. That's going to be on inequality and the pandemic. Again, that's bright and early at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning, Thursday, the 30th of April. Or if you're from overseas, it'll be 4 o'clock New York time, Wednesday. Next Tuesday at 11 a.m., we're going to be talking to Nobel laureate Professor and immunologist Peter Doherty, the patron and namesake of the Doherty Institute, about the public health response to COVID-19. That's on Tuesday, the 5th of May at 11 a.m. You can find ways to register for that on our website at tai.org.au. And please, if you are in a position to help chip in a few dollars to help cover the cost of these webinars, we'd really appreciate it. Again, you can donate on our website, and every little bit helps. Make sure you are subscribed to our podcast, Follow the Money, where in our latest episode we talk about the principles, the design principles for a well-targeted economic recovery plan and ways that you can measure the relative merits of different proposals for how we can manage the economic response and recovery. So we'll wrap it up there. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I think I'll have to check the numbers, but I do think this is the most popular webinar or indeed event anywhere that the Australia Institute has done. So thank you again to Richard, thank you to Jim Chalmers, and thank you to all of you for joining us today.
This has been a special episode of Follow the Money, and we're aiming to bring you shorter but more frequent episodes during the pandemic, so please make sure you're subscribed. For the latest health information, you can check health.gov.au or listen to the ABC's excellent CoronaCast podcast, which comes out daily. The Australia Institute's next webinar will be about the public health response with Nobel laureate Professor and immunologist Peter Doherty, patron and namesake of the Doherty Institute. That's next Tuesday, the 5th of May at 11 a.m. You can visit tai.org.au for all our latest research and content. We're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a _N_T. Jim Chalmers is at JE Chalmers, and Richard Dennis is at RDNS_TAI. And this episode was produced by Jennifer Macey with production help from Lucy Luo. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeat from Pulse and Thrum, and you can find more of his music at pulseandthrum.com. Please wash your hands regularly, don't go out unless you have to, and thanks for listening.